Part 2, Chapter 1, The Indian Ocean. We now come to the second part of our journey under the sea. The first ended with the moving scene in the coral cemetery, which left such a deep impression on my mind. Thus, in the midst of the great sea, Captain Nemo's life was passing even to his grave, which he had prepared in one of its deepest abysses. There not one of the ocean's monsters could trouble the last sleep of the crew of the Nautilus. Of these friends, riveted to each other in death as in life. Nor any man either, had added the captain. Still the same fierce, implacable defiance towards human society. I could no longer content myself with the hypothesis which satisfied counsel. That worthy fellow persisted in seeing in the commander of the Nautilus one of those unknown savants who return mankind's contempt for indifference. For him he was a misunderstood genius who, tired of earth's deceptions, had taken refuge in the inaccessible medium which he might follow his instincts freely. To my mind, this hypothesis explained but one side of Captain Nemo's character. Indeed, the mystery of that last night during which we had been chained in prison, the sleep, and the precaution so violently taken by the captain of snatching from my eyes the glass I had risen to sweep the horizon, the mortal wound of the man due to an unaccountable shock of the Nautilus, all put me on a new track. No, Captain Nemo was not satisfied with shunning man. His formidable apparatus not only suited his instinct of freedom, but perhaps also the design of some terrible retaliation. At this moment nothing is clear to me. I catch but a glimpse of the light amidst all the darkness, and I must confine myself to writing as events shall dictate. That day, the 24th of January, 1868, at noon, the second officer came to take the altitude of the sun. I mounted the platform, lit a cigarette, and watched the operation. It seemed to me that the man did not understand French, for several times I made remarks in a loud voice which must have drawn from him some involuntary sign of attention, if he understood them, but he remained undisturbed and dumb. As he was taking observations with the sextant, one of the sailors in the Nautilus, the strong man who had accompanied us on our first submarine excursion to the island of Crespo, came to clean the glasses of the lantern. I examined the fittings of the apparatus, the strength of which was increased 100-fold by lenticular rings, placed similar to those in a lighthouse, and which projected their brilliance in a horizontal plane. The electric lamp was combined in such a way as to give its most powerful light. Indeed, it was produced in vacuum, which ensured both its steadiness and its intensity. This vacuum economized the graphite points between which the luminous arc was developed, an important point of economy for Captain Nemo, who could not easily have replaced them, and under these conditions their waste was imperceptible. When the Nautilus was ready to continue its submarine journey, I went down to the saloon. The panels were closed, and the course marked direct west. We were furrowing the waters of the Indian Ocean, a vast liquid plain with the surface of 1,200,000,000 of acres, and whose waters are so clear and transparent that anyone leaning over them would turn giddy. And the Nautilus usually floated between 50 and 100 fathoms deep. We went on for some days. To anyone but myself, who had a great love of the sea, the hours would have seemed long and monotonous, but the daily walks on the platform, when I steeped myself in the reviving air of the ocean, the sight of the rich waters through the windows of the saloon, the books in the library, the compiling of my memoirs took up all of my time, and left me not a moment of ennui or weariness. For some days we saw a great number of aquatic birds, sea-mews, or gulls. Some were cleverly killed and prepared in a certain way, made very acceptable water game. Amongst large winged birds carried a long distance from all lands and resting upon the waves from the fatigue of their flight, I saw some magnificent albatrosses uttering discordant cries like the braying of an ass, and birds belonging to the family of the longipinates. The family of the totipalates was presented by the sea swallows which caught the fish from the surface, and by numerous phaetons and lepturi. Amongst others, the phaeton with red lines as large as a pigeon. whose white plumage tinted with pink shows off to advantage the blackness of its wings. As to the fish, they always provoked our admiration when we surprised the secrets of their aquatic life through the open panels. I saw many kinds which I never before had a chance of observing. I shall notice chiefly Austrasians, peculiar to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and that part which washes the coast of tropical America. These fishes, like the tortoise, the armadillo, the sea hedgehog, and the crustacea, are protected by a breastplate which is neither chalky nor stony, but real bone. In some it takes the form of a solid triangle, in others of a solid quadrangle. Amongst the triangular I saw some 1.5 inches in length, with wholesome flesh and a delicious flavor. They are brown at the tail and yellow at the fins, and I recommend their introduction into fresh water, to which a certain number of sea fish easily accustom themselves. I would also mention quadrangular Austrasians, having on the back 4 large tubercles, some dotted over with white spots on the lower part of the body, and which may be tamed like birds. Trigons provided with spikes formed by the lengthening of their bony shell, and which from their strange gruntings are called sea pigs. Also dromedaries with large humps in the shape of a cone, whose flesh is very tough and leathery. I now borrow from the daily notes of Master Counsel. Quote, certain fish, the genus Petrodon, peculiar to those seas, with red backs and white chests, which are distinguished by 3 rows of longitudinal filaments, and some electricals 7 inches long, decked in the liveliest of colors. Then, as specimens of other kinds, some ovoids resembling an egg of a dark brown color, marked with white bands and without tails, diodons, real sea porcupines, furnished with spikes and capable of swelling in such a way as to look like cushions bristling with darts. Hippocampi, common to every ocean, some pagaci with lengthened snouts, which their pectoral fins, being much elongated and formed in the shape of wings, allow, if not to fly, at least shoot into the air. Pigeons spatulae, with tails covered with many rings of shell. Magranthanthi, with large jaws, an excellent fish, 9 inches long, and bright with the most agreeable colors. Pale-colored calamores with rugged heads, and plenty of cetodons, with long and tubular muzzles which kill insects by shooting them, as from an air gun with a single drop of water. These we may call the fly-catchers of the seas. And the 89th genus of fishes, called the Lecipitae, belonging to the second lower class of bony, characterized by opercules and bronchial membranes. I remarked the Scorpinia, the head of which is furnished with spikes, and which has but 1 dorsal fin. Well, these creatures are covered, or not, with little shells according to the subclass to which they belong. The second subclass gives us specimens of didactyls, 14 or 15 inches in length, with yellow rays and heads of a most fantastic appearance. As to the first subclass, it gives several specimens of that singular-looking fish appropriately called a sea frog, with large heads sometimes pierced with holes, sometimes swollen with protuberances, bristling with spikes, and covered with tubercles. It has irregular and hideous horns. Its body and tail are covered with calicites. Its sting makes a dangerous wound. It is both repugnant and horrible to look at. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, the Nautilus went at the rate of 250 leagues in 24 hours, being 540 miles or 22 miles an hour. If we recognized so many different varieties of fish, it was because, attracted by the electric light, they tried to follow us. The greater part, however, were soon distanced by our speed, though some kept their pace in the water of the Nautilus for a time. The morning of the 24th, in 12 degrees 5 south latitude and 94 degrees 33 longitude, we observed kneeling iron, a madrepore formation planted with significant cocos, and which had been visited by Mr. Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. The Nautilus skirted the shores of this desert island for a little distance, and its nets brought up numerous specimens of polypi and curious shells of mollusca. Some precious productions of the species of delphini enriched with the treasures of Captain Nemo, to which I added an Astrea punctifera, a kind of parasite polypus, often found fixed to a shell. Soon Kneeling Island disappeared from the horizon, and our course was directed to the northwest, in the direction of the Indian Peninsula. From Keeling Island, our course was slower and more variable, often taking us into great depths. Several times they made use of the inclined planes, which certain internal levers placed obliquely to the waterline. In that way we went about 2 miles, but without ever obtaining the greatest depths of the Indian Sea, which soundings of 7,000 fathoms have never reached. As to the temperature of the lower strata, the thermometer invariably indicated 4 degrees above zero. I only observed in the upper regions the water was always colder in the high levels than at the surface of the sea. On the 25th of January, the ocean was entirely deserted. The Nautilus passed the day on the surface, beating the waves with its powerful screw and making them rebound to a great height. Who, under such circumstances, would not have taken it for a gigantic cetacean? 3 parts of this day I spent on the platform. I watched the sea. Nothing on the horizon till about 4 o'clock, a steamer running west on our counter. Her masts were visible for an instant, but she could not see the Nautilus, being too low in the water. I fancied the steamboat belonged to the P.O. Company, which runs from Ceylon to Sydney, touching at King George's Point in Melbourne. At 5 o'clock in the evening, before that fleeting twilight which binds night to day in tropical zones, Council and I were astonished by a curious spectacle. It was a shoal of Argonauts traveling along on the surface of the ocean. We could count several hundreds. They belonged to the tubercle kind, which are peculiar to the Indian Ocean. Well, these graceful mollusks moved backwards by means of their locomotive tube, through which they propelled the water already drawn in. Of their 8 tentacles, 6 were elongated and stretched out, floating on the water, whilst the other 2, rolled up flat, were spread to the wind like a light sail. I saw their spiral-shaped and fluted shells, which Cuvier justly compares to an elegant skiff, a boat indeed, why it bears the creature which secretes it without its adhering to it. For nearly an hour the Nautilus floated in the midst of this shoal of mollusks. Then, I know not what sudden fright they took, but, as if at a signal, every sail was furled, the arms folded, the body drawn in, the shells turned over, changing their center of gravity, and the whole fleet disappeared under the waves. Never did the ships of a squadron maneuver with more unity. At that moment night fell suddenly, and the reeds, scarcely raised by the breeze, lay peacefully under the sides of the Nautilus. The next day, the 26th of January, we cut the equator at the 82nd meridian and entered the northern hemisphere. During the day, a formidable troop of sharks accompanied us, terrible creatures which multiply in these seas and make them very dangerous. They were Cestaceo philippi sharks, with brown backs and whitish bellies, armed with 11 rows of teeth. Eyed sharks, their throat being marked with a large black spot, surrounded with white like an eye. There were also some Isabella sharks with rounded snouts marked with dark spots. Well, these powerful creatures often hurled themselves at the windows of the saloon with such violence as to make us feel very insecure. At such times, Ned Land was no longer master of himself. He wanted to go to the surface and harpoon the monsters, particularly certain smooth hound sharks, whose mouth is studded with teeth like a mosaic, and large tiger sharks nearly 6 yards long, the last named of which seemed to excite him more particularly. But the Nautilus, accelerating her sea, easily left the most rapid of them behind. The 27th of January, at the entrance of the vast Bay of Bengal, we met repeatedly a forbidding spectacle, dead bodies floating on the surface of the water. They were the dead of the Indian villages carried by the Ganges to the level of the sea, and which the vultures, the only undertakers of the country, had not been able to devour, but the sharks did not fail to help them at their funeral work. About 7 o'clock in the evening, the Nautilus, half immersed, was sailing in a sea of milk. At first sight, the ocean seemed lactified. Was it the effect of the lunar rays? No, for the moon, scarcely 2 days old, was still lying hidden under the horizon at the rays of the sun. The whole sky, though lit by the sidereal rays, seemed black by contrast with the whiteness of the waters. Counsel could not believe his eyes and questioned me as to the cause of this strange phenomenon. Happily, I was able to answer him. It is called a milk sea, I explained. A large extent of white wavelets, often to be seen on the coasts of Amboina and in these parts of the sea. But, sir, said Counsel, can you tell me what causes such an effect? For I suppose the water is not really turned into milk. No, my boy, and the whiteness which surprises you is caused only by the presence of myriads of infurosia, a sort of luminous little worm, gelatinous and without color of the thickness of a hair, and whose length is not more than 7/1000 of an inch. Well, these insects adhere to one another sometimes for several leagues. Several leagues? Exclaimed Counsel. Yes, my boy, and you need not try to compute the number of these infurosa. You will not be able, for, if I am not mistaken, ships have floated on these milk seas for more than 40 miles. Towards midnight, the sea suddenly resumed its usual color, but behind us, even to the limits of the horizon, the sky reflected the whitened waves, and for a long time seemed impregnated with the vague glimmerings of an aurora borealis.